Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for another workshop for Textile Summer 2023. And for those of you who might be joining me outside of that program, it's okay to see this workshop as a single serve workshop, but keep in mind that throughout the summer, we've also been discussing different issues and data. I will link to some papers at the end of this talk that are great references to go to. And that this talk is just a small kind of piece to a larger discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So I like to just kind of type as we begin. So as we begin, I'd like to begin with this disclaimer. I cannot include every issue in this video, nor am I an expert on every single issue. This video's purpose is to prompt your thinking about DEI issues that you may not already know about. I'm not saying that I know the ultimate opinion. I'm not saying that I specifically know the solutions. There are some really fantastic discussions that are happening, but don't take this video as an end all be all. One of my career goals is to build on this video along with bioethicists, along with experts in different fields, combining engineering, neuroscientists, sociologists to actually create a course with guest lectures on these issues that'll be more useful. But for now, this is just what I have learned in my experiences and in some of my reading about things that are good to consider. So I'm not the expert. I'm trying. I hope that this will prompt some thinking. So when I think about diversity in data, something that I think is important to know that I didn't really realize to consider on multiple levels. Oh, before we get into that, we have to consider DEIS issues from a variety of levels. So here I'm talking about them in data science applied to neuroscience. So we have two very different areas there. Data science is a lot about how we're handling data, a lot of computational techniques, a lot of algorithms. Neuroscience is really about where we're getting that data from. If we're working in humans, what are those patient populations? It's also, who created the ways that we think about conceptual frameworks. I'm not in a field like psychology. I'm in a field of cell biology. But if you're into fields of psychology, I am also not working with human patients. If you're working with human patients, you need to deal with a lot more socioeconomic issues. You need to be a lot more considerate of a lot of more complex social dynamics that come into play in human research as compared to cell research or into animal research. Not that those don't exist, and not that we do not need to care about those issues if we would like to apply anything that we design down the line. But also, as someone with an engineering background, there's a lot of DEI issues that come into engineering research, such as in chemical engineering. Something that's important is if we're working on chemical plants or we're building chemical plants, what are the populations that those plants are likely to exist? Are they likely to be in lower socioeconomic issues? Are we causing issues that are going to contaminate wastewater? But also who has access to things like nicer vaccines, who's getting them first. That's something we saw play out during COVID. These are all issues that can come into engineering and into supply chain. And then also I am in academia. So these are issues of who actually has access to academics, who are the people that are likely getting into academia. Part of this program is to help increase access to students that have never had research experience, increase access to students that are maybe first gen or from populations that don't normally have access to programs like this or to researchers like this. And so that there's so many ways to think about this, but this is just how I contextualize part of my piece and part of the perspective that I'm coming from and part of the perspective I can speak of. So when you think of DEIS, you probably think of the first word or diversity. And so when I want to introduce students to these topics, I want to introduce students to the topic that diversity is quite a complex topic. And when we're thinking about it, a lot of times the students that I talk to mainly think about diversity in the data that we're analyzing, but there's so many more ways to study it. So diversity needs to be the both the populations that we study, plus who is actually doing the studying. So if we have a diverse population, but the people that are studying that population are not diverse or do not have representation from the population we're trying to reach, we're going to likely be missing a lot of information. And then who is creating, especially in data science, but also in neuroscience, who's creating the algorithms or the methodologies we're using to do the studying? Something that comes into mind, there's a pretty popular algorithm and study that was supposed to tell if people from their photos were seen as trustworthy, and it was a super sexist study where if women weren't wearing makeup and they weren't smiling, then they weren't seen as so trustworthy. There's so many ways that comes into that. Another thing you can think of more medically is the development of a pulse oximeter, which has shown to have different statistical differences based off of skin color. So these are just some little facets that can become quite major issues if they're not considered from a diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. When you're thinking about diversity, you may think that you want a diverse population. So what do we mean by diverse population? Well, we mean things like sex and we mean things like gender. And those two are not a direct correlation of combination. There are really fantastic resources out there to learn about biological sex and gender and how diverse the spectrum of biological sex is, and how socio and sociologically motivated gender can be, and how that is different from one person to the other, and how there can also be very different approaches to sex versus gender depending on the culture that you come from. This is not an area that I am an expert in, but it is something that is important. In our own research, we do include both male and female biological sexes of rats in our studies, at rats and ferrets. It's a little bit more complicated to study something like gender in a rat population, but it's really important that you keep in mind sex and gender in your studies. Historically, women have been excluded from a lot of studies because it was believed that their menstrual cycles were a confounding factor on being able to study medicines in them. And so there were tons of medicines that were approved and treatments that were approved without ever having been tested in women. This has changed more recently. If you want to read some fantastic books, I will cite some books at the end. You can reach out to me. I have some more books to include. Depending on your study, you may also want to consider something like sexual orientation. This is just going to depend on the field that you're working in. But then there's also major issues to include, such as racism and colorism can also come into play. There's a fantastic paper and a fantastic researcher out of the University of Minnesota who I saw at a Hershey Neurodevelopmental Brain Conference a couple years ago, who studied how both racism and colorism impacted maternal outcomes during pregnancy. And so those are both important, but you can also get into diverse populations such as age. Are you considering different ages of your participants? We're on the neurodevelopmental side. And so how do different ages across the developmental spectrum change how you're going to treat those patients and change how you're going to be able to interact with those patients? But you also have the standard adult ages. You have teenagers who may not have all the legal authority that they do as an adult, to the geriatric population, and how are those seen differently? Are they treated equitably in your studies? Are they treated equitably in your team? Are you including people from a diverse range of ages in your team as well? Disabilities. This is important if you're wanting to study certain populations. It's also really important, depending on what you're going to study, to include people that have disabilities, especially if you are doing disability research. Do you have experts on your team who can understand and talk to these disabilities? And then we'll include nationalities, geographic areas of origin. Where are people being raised? How does where are people being raised change their culture, change how they culturally approach something, change the resources that they had, change anything from diet to amount of sun in the day can all be things that come into play. Another thing that is important to account for that is often overlooked is disease state. How severe is a disease that you are studying? Is it important that you study an entire range of severity? Are you only considering a specific type of severity? Are you only considering a certain way that a disease presents? Are you only considering a certain way that a person self-reflects how a disease is impacting them? And does this change based off of the population and how much trust they have with a doctor, or how willing they are to share something about themselves with said doctor or said researcher? Or does that population have a history of not being able to trust researchers? And does that impact how your study may come across? And neurodiversity, are you including a large range of neurodiversity into your study, into your team, and into your outcomes? So these are just some of the populations. There are so many more populations that you can get into. You need to understand the populations that matter in your research, understand why they matter, and how you can get input from populations that do matter, how you can work with humanities, how you can work with ethicists, people that make their careers out of ethics to see, is this a way that we can approach this population? Is there a way that we can include more people? And again, this isn't just on the data that you include. Why are you studying this population without input from a population? Are there ways that you can bring in experts to your team? And who created these algorithms? Are these algorithms biased towards a certain population? Such as, just a tame example, is there a data set that's about like plants, and you want to learn all that you can about those plants, but the data set was only planned on where I grew up, the Sonoran Desert. So if you tried to apply that data set to another geographical area, such as the PNW, the Pacific Northwest, that has completely different plants, how can you use that data set to compare there versus there, when in the desert it's going to be skewed towards cacti, and in the PNW you're going to need to skew towards these much greener vegetations? This isn't a direct example to anything specific. It's just an example of know where your training data comes from, where you're applying it, and how that's going to impact anybody. Some basic data issues, although I will cite to a paper later in this presentation that you can get into a lot more data issues. So things that people often think of is wanting to fill the gaps on these diverse populations for training sets that we do have. And while that is a really, I think, valiant effort, you also want to ask the question of, do the populations want you to fill the gap? So specifically in instances of a population that has been historically mistreated, are they going to trust you with that data? Or in populations that view medicine in a different way than traditional Western medicine, which is not always the best or the most right way, do they want to provide you data to test things in that way either? Yes, we should definitely fill gaps if we're going to use training data and we're going to apply it to a population, but what does that even mean? How many people do you even need? Do you need them from the same time era? If all of our data is from the 80s, do you need a bunch new people from the 2010s? It's a very complex issue. We talked about who is designing algorithms, but also who is going to be applying algorithms. So even if you build an algorithm, for example, the paper that I include later talks about an algorithm that is used for dermatology, but it was tested a majority on a white male skin. And so that presented very differently than Black participants. And they found that it wasn't working on people with higher pigmentation than their skin. When you're applying the algorithm, do you have doctors that know to take care of these things? Do you have doctors that know that they should account for this? Or do you have people that are just going to be blindly trusting your algorithm because they don't know any of this information? And as you go along, are they building in bias themselves? Not necessarily for that exercise, but if we're applying algorithms to a certain population and then we have people giving feedback loops to those algorithms and saying this is how something is working versus how it isn't working, is that building in a continual training bias? And then something else people talk about is that we can have a lot of data, but a lot of times that data needs to be labeled. So who is doing the labeling of that data? How is that labeling being done? And are we labeling all of the data? Do we have, comparative labels, these types of things? When we get into issues of equity, an important thing to keep in mind is that equity doesn't necessarily equal equality. You can find some really fantastic resources to go into how equity is different than equality, but the only questions I want to bring up in just this short video is really how will data science, oh, it's supposed to be does not necessarily equal equality. Is that does not? I'll type it. Does not necessarily equal equality. How will data science findings be applied? Who is applying them? And who makes decisions if things go awry? Or, well, so in equity, you're going to want to include the same populations as above, but you also might want to include in some issues of poverty. You're probably going to want to include those above as well, but I'm just going to include these here. So if you have some really nice scientific algorithm and you're applying it to a population, who is that population impacting? Some popular examples that haven't gone well is face identification, in police scans that are racially biased and they're not supported by scientific evidence. And so that is definitely a major racism issue in these populations. But another thing that can be considered if you were to create like an AI algorithm that were to decide who gets COVID vaccines first, how is that impacting different socioeconomic backgrounds, and how is it built in to impact those backgrounds? Access, I spelled poverty wrong. Access to resources. If you are building these really nice algorithms that are supposed to make people's lives easier, are people having equitable access to these algorithms or these methods or these faster or better ways of diagnosing diseases? If you do create this thing and it is working and you can diagnose diseases so much better, but you have to be at a major hospital in a big city and have enough money to access that thing, is that equitable? And just some other things to keep in mind, since I brought it up earlier, like environmental pollution. Are there areas that are more impacted by a certain disease that you would want to consider first, or that needs different considerations, or that has a confounding variable because of environmental pollution, or people that live in cities versus rural areas? There's so much to take into consideration, but these are just some ways of bringing out a few more populations. Again, it's not everything. I'm not the expert on everything. I just want to ask a few more questions that'll prompt a few more issues. Inclusion, when I think about this, I think about some major questions in data science and neuroscience. Who is being included in all stages of experimental design? So this isn't just who's being included in your data set and who do you want to apply something to, but this is genuinely who is at the table deciding who's going to be included. And so there are major issues in academia and there are major issues in STEM. There are gender issues. There are major race inequalities in STEM and academia. But alongside that as well, you can bring in experts from a certain population. So if you're working with a certain disease population, do you have them involved in the experimental design if it's a major experiment and you need specific involvement? Or if you're planning on developing some type of tool to be used in a clinic or to be used by patients, are you involving people in the design of that tool that are going to need to use that tool? Such as, are you involving blind patients in a tool and will it be able to help them, and are they included? Are you involving people that have different mobility into the tool? These are things that might be important just depending on what you're going to design. And then you want to include who is giving feedback. Are you only getting feedback from like a small academic group that continually feeds into each other? Are you getting feedback from the population that you're hoping to help with hopefully you have the goal of helping someone, and who is included in experiments as subjects, as researchers, as authors, as any type of investor. Who are you including? What are they getting out of this? Do they feel like they're included, seen, giving feedback in this process? And do they feel like they all have equal access? So these are just a little bit of the issues. I brought up some other points here in this one. Accessibility. Who has the access to read your research? Does the population that you're trying to help actually have access to the papers that you're writing, and they can give you feedback on them and they can see what you're doing? Who has access to the data? Can other people run experiments off of what you've run? Who has access to you? Who has access to understanding your experiments? Accessibility is a major part of this story. And then I also don't want to leave out sovereignty, because I think it is something that can be left out. So specifically, what I have worked with in the past is Indigenous sovereignty. So Indigenous sovereignty is the concept describing the inherent authority of Indigenous tribes and groups to govern themselves. This includes to govern their own data and how it is used in medical research. So when I first did some research in undergraduate, we were looking for a single nucleotide polymorphism that mainly occurred in the Navajo Nation in Arizona. Before we did any work, we had to have an agreement between the Navajo Nation that was okay to work on this work. We had to have training in the proper language to use in order to actually help the children of the Navajo Nation that we were attempting to help. And if at any point they wanted the research to stop, we fully respected the ability to stop the research. And so sovereignty is unique in that it is inherent, it is special to each Indigenous group, and it is how they're choosing to govern themselves, and they also own their data. And so this is important to keep in mind with regards to tissue and with regards to any sample, such as a blood sample that may or may not already exist. What are you doing with it? And have you actually asked the group that you would like to work with if this can be done, and have you followed all the correct procedures? I'm not the expert on Indigenous sovereignty at all. There are really fantastic resources and fantastic groups that are working out there. One of the areas that I have seen most in popular media lately is climate sovereignty and the rights, inherent rights that Indigenous populations have to climate equity. And so that's just another thing that I don't hear talked about very often that I think about is important to bring up. I said that I would link a couple books. I have tried to read a lot of books about these topics, and I will actually be doing a book review at the end of the year just on all the fantastic books that I have gotten to read in the past couple of years that are related to these topics, just so that I can have a place people can learn more in the way that I have learned. And I'm currently putting that together. But the books that I recommend now, especially for the audience that I'm trying to reach, which are high school students and undergrads that are new to this area, especially neurodevelopmental research and data science. So a really fantastic book is The Secret Life of Henrietta Lacks, which are about HeLa cells and about really the medical history on how she never had any input and if she wanted her cells to be used this way. A book I read recently that's about the history of OBGYN is Medical Bondage. It's a really, really fantastic book about how different populations were treated differently in the sake of science, and how even though that seems like it's a long time ago, a lot of the connotations still hold into OBGYN and women's health research today. And then The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which talks a lot about the history, and definitely not always the good history, of genetics. Some really fantastic papers. The paper that I had my textile students read. Here, let me pull up a window. My cat is meowing in the background. I apologize. So this one is addressing bias in big data and AI for healthcare, a call for open science, which is an open science perspective on what we can do. They have some really fantastic papers about other ways that bias sneaks into the process. There's a paper that's on trend of women's health research in Korea. I think this is an interesting paper as I'm someone that's interested in women's health, and particularly in the US, not in South Korea, that women's health outcomes have been decreasing, even though we're supposedly this really great developed nation. Oh, and then this one didn't give me a link. And then this is a paper that's less about diversity issues and more about scientific discovery in the age of artificial intelligence, but it brings up some really fantastic scientific issues about what we do in an age where science is really being transformed by large access to high-powered computing and high-powered algorithms. Cool. So those are some papers. My final thoughts are really just you cannot know everything and you cannot be an expert on everything, which is why it is so important to communicate. It's why it is so important that we have like institutional review boards and we have IACUC boards for animal research and for human research. But it's really important that you try to stay informed as well, which is why I try to at least once a week attend seminars about DEIS issues related to both my work and related to the larger world, why I try to read books by experts, by people who have put the time in or have like personal history in populations to talk more about issues that we should care about, and why if as scientists we truly want to help a population, we should be trying to include populations in all aspects of our research. Because that's what is important. So this couldn't hit on everything. I may have said some things incorrectly, and I will correct them in the future to be the most accessible and the most open to the huge array of issues that exist in these topics in neuroscience and data science. But I hope this is a nice little starter to kind of prompt more thinking and exploration for the high school students and undergraduates that this program is for, that may not have started this journey at all about learning about these topics in scientific research specifically. So thank you all for joining me. That is the end of this video.